More than 6 decades after a small sitcom about 7 stranded castaways first aired, only one original Gilligan's Island star is still alive. While the rest of the beloved cast slowly disappeared one by one through illness, cancer, and old age, Tina Louise remained the final living connection to a show that never truly disappeared from American pop culture. But behind the glamorous image of Ginger Grant was a woman who spent much of her life trying to escape the very role that made her famous. Now in her 90s, Louise lives with the strange reality of being the last survivor of a television phenomenon that shaped generations while carrying memories of an entire cast that is no longer here to share them. Long before Tina Louise became known around the world as Ginger Grant, she was a serious young actress from New York who believed her future belonged on dramatic stages, not inside a goofy television sitcom. Born Tina Blacker in New York City in 1934, she grew up during a difficult period marked by her parents' divorce when she was still very young. Acting quickly became both an escape and a personal ambition. By her late teens, she was already pursuing stage work professionally, eventually appearing in Broadway productions, including the musical Lil Abner. Unlike many actresses who enter Hollywood through television, Louise originally wanted to build a respected career in theater and film. She studied under legendary acting teacher Lee Strasberg at the Actors Studio, surrounding herself with performers who treated acting like a serious craft rather than simple entertainment. During the late 1950s, Louise's career actually looked very promising. She modeled for magazines, appeared in Playboy photo spreads, and started landing film roles that positioned her as a rising Hollywood beauty with legitimate talent. Her film debut in God's Little Acre attracted attention quickly, and she even won a Golden Globe Award as a promising newcomer. Studio executives believed she could become a major dramatic actress, especially after appearing in movies like Day of the Outlaw and The Hangman. At that point, nobody associated her with comedy or television. In fact, television was still viewed by many actors as a lower status medium compared to film and Broadway. Louise herself reportedly had little interest in becoming a sitcom actress. That changed when producers behind a strange new comedy series contacted her about replacing another actress in the pilot episode. Gilligan's Island already existed in rough form, but the role of Ginger Grant had not fully worked yet. Originally, Ginger was written more like a practical secretary instead of the glamorous movie star audiences would later recognize. Producers wanted someone with charisma, beauty, and enough confidence to dominate scenes alongside an already colorful cast. Tina Louise fit perfectly. Ironically, Louise almost did not take the role at all. Years later, she recalled that a friend convinced her to accept the offer by telling her the show would probably last only 6 months. To Louise, that sounded harmless. She could do the sitcom quickly, collect a paycheck, and then return to more serious acting projects afterward. But almost immediately after Gilligan's Island premiered, the series became far bigger than anyone expected. The simple story about 7 stranded castaways connected with audiences across America because of its humor, familiarity, and easy escapism. Bob Denver's clumsy Gilligan became a cultural phenomenon, while Ginger Grant quickly became one of television's most recognizable blonde bombshells. At first, Louise was reportedly frustrated with how narrowly Ginger was written. Early scripts treated the character like a basic Marilyn Monroe imitation, focusing almost entirely on glamour and flirtation. But as the series evolved, different directors and writers started giving Ginger more personality and sharper comedic moments. Louise later admitted that once that change happened, she genuinely enjoyed playing the role. Still, the success of Gilligan's Island created a problem she never fully escaped. No matter how many dramatic films or television appearances she made afterward, millions of viewers no longer saw Tina Louise the actress. To them, she was simply Ginger forever. As Gilligan's Island exploded in popularity during syndication throughout the 1970s and 1980s, something unexpected happened to Tina Louise. The show became even bigger after it had already ended. Children coming home from school watched reruns every afternoon, and a completely new generation became attached to the stranded castaways. While many actors would have celebrated that kind of lasting fame, Louise increasingly seemed uncomfortable with how deeply audiences connected her identity to Ginger Grant. The more successful the reruns became, the harder it became for her to separate herself from the character. Unlike the rest of the cast, Louise refused to participate in the reunion movies that followed. Rescue from Gilligan's Island, The Castaways on Gilligan's Island, and The Harlem Globetrotters on Gilligan's Island all moved forward without her. Different actresses stepped into the role of Ginger each time. For years, this created rumors that Louise hated both the show and her former castmates. Fans often interpreted her absence as bitterness or arrogance, especially because the rest of the surviving cast members appeared eager to reunite, but the reality was more complicated. Louise was desperately trying to preserve what remained of her identity as a serious actress. While Bob Denver fully embraced Gilligan for the rest of his life, Louise took the opposite approach. She continued pursuing film and television work outside the Island universe. She appeared alongside Dean Martin in The Wrecking Crew, joined the ensemble cast of The Stepford Wives, and later appeared in shows like Jack, Chips, Dallas, and Married with Children. But despite continuing to work steadily, she could never entirely outrun Ginger's shadow. Hollywood itself often reinforced the problem by continuing to cast her as glamorous or seductive women instead of giving her the kind of dramatic reinvention many actors crave. Over time, however, Louise's attitude softened. In later interviews, especially during her 90s, she openly rejected the lawn-gunning myth that she hated the role. She explained that once writers expanded Ginger beyond a simple Marilyn Monroe stereotype, she genuinely enjoyed playing her. That public honesty surprised many longtime fans because it contradicted decades of tabloid assumptions surrounding her relationship with the series. As the decades passed, Tina Louise found herself watching the Gilligan's Island cast slowly disappear one by one. The deaths came gradually, but together they transformed her into something few actors ever experience, the final living witness to a television world that once felt immortal. In 1989, Jim Backus became the first main cast member to die after battling Parkinson's disease for years. Audiences remembered him as millionaire Thurston Howell III, but Louise remembered the man behind the comedy, an experienced actor who had already achieved major Hollywood success before the sitcom even existed. Only months later, Alan Hale Jr., the beloved skipper, was diagnosed with thymus cancer and died in early 1990. Hale had remained deeply connected to fans of the series and fully embraced the role for the rest of his life, even opening a restaurant themed around the skipper character. The losses continued. Natalie Schafer, who played Lovey Howell, died from liver cancer not long afterward. Russell Johnson, the dependable professor who had once served in World War II before becoming an actor, lived longer than many of his castmates, but eventually passed away from kidney failure in 2014. Bob Denver, perhaps the heart of the entire show, died in 2005 following complications from throat cancer surgery. By that point, the cast that once represented comfort and laughter for millions of Americans was steadily vanishing into television history. Then came perhaps the most emotional loss for longtime fans. Dawn Wells, remembered as the warm and cheerful Mary Ann, died in late 2020 from complications related to COVID-19. Her death hit particularly hard because Wells had remained extremely connected to Gilligan's Island fans throughout her life. She attended conventions, wrote books about the series, and openly embraced Mary Ann as a meaningful part of her identity. In the years before her death, reports also revealed she had been quietly struggling financially and facing serious medical debt after the recession. Friends eventually organized a fundraiser that raised more than $200,000 to help her. By the time Wells died, Tina Louise officially became the last surviving cast member from the original series. That reality gave her public appearances a very different emotional tone. Every interview now carried an unavoidable reminder that an entire era of television and the people who created it had almost completely disappeared. What makes Tina Louise's later years especially tragic is not scandal, financial collapse, or public disgrace. In many ways, her ending is quieter and more unsettling than that. She survived long enough to watch her entire television family disappear, while carrying the strange burden of being permanently attached to a fictional character she spent decades trying to escape. For younger audiences discovering Gilligan's Island through streaming services, Louise is no longer simply an actress from another era. She has become the final living symbol of a vanished world of television history. By the time she entered her late 80s and early 90s, Louise's public appearances had become increasingly rare. Unlike many aging television stars who spend their later years on nostalgia tours or convention circuits, she largely stepped away from that world. She did not fully isolate herself from the public, but she chose a far quieter existence than many fans probably expected. In interviews, there was often a noticeable difference between Louise and some of her former castmates. Bob Denver and Dawn Wells openly leaned into the emotional connection fans had with Gilligan's Island. Louise, meanwhile, seemed more interested in preserving her own personal identity outside the sitcom. At the same time, age inevitably changed how she viewed the show itself. In earlier decades, she appeared defensive whenever reporters framed Ginger Grant as the defining achievement of her career. But later in life, her tone became softer and more reflective. She acknowledged that the series brought comfort and happiness to millions of people during difficult periods of their lives. She also seemed to accept that no matter how many dramatic films or stage performances she completed, Gilligan's Island would remain the role people remembered most. One detail from her later years surprised many people. Despite decades of fame, Louise quietly spent time working as a reading tutor at a Manhattan public school well into her 90s. There was something deeply human about that image. While television viewers continued replaying old episodes of Gilligan's Island across streaming platforms, the final surviving castaway was spending part of her week helping children learn to read instead of reliving her old celebrity status. That contrast is ultimately what makes her story feel so emotionally complicated. Tina Louise survived the fame, the typecasting, the endless rumors, and the deaths of her castmates. But survival itself can sometimes become its own lonely burden. Today, Tina Louise exists in a strange position that very few actors in television history ever experience. At more than 90 years old, she is no longer simply remembered as an actress who appeared on a successful sitcom. She has become the final living connection to a cast that once felt inseparable in the minds of viewers. Every surviving clip, interview, and reunion photograph now carries extra emotional weight because Louise is the only person left who can still personally remember what life on that set was actually like. The others exist through reruns and archived interviews. She alone remains in the present. What makes this even more remarkable is that Gilligan's Island was never originally considered prestigious television. Critics during its original run often dismissed it as silly escapist entertainment. Yet decades later, the series outlived countless serious dramas that once seemed far more important. The show remained alive through syndication, animated spin-offs, reunion films, streaming platforms, and generations of families introducing it to younger viewers. Tina Louise herself once believed the sitcom would disappear after a few months. Instead, it became the role that followed her for the rest of her life. There is also a certain sadness in how completely time transformed the cast's legacy. Bob Denver, Alan Hale Jr., Jim Botches, Natalie Schafer, Russell Johnson, and Dawn Wells all spent years attending reunions, speaking warmly about the show and reconnecting with fans who viewed the cast almost like extended family members. One by one, those familiar faces disappeared. Each death changed the emotional meaning of the series a little more. By the time Dawn Wells died in 2020, many longtime viewers suddenly realized that an era they grew up with was nearly gone forever. And yet, Tina Louise continues moving forward quietly. She no longer acts regularly, rarely seeks publicity, and seems comfortable living outside the spotlight that once defined her. In some ways, that may be the most surprising ending of all. The woman who spent years trying not to be remembered only as Ginger Grant eventually became the final guardian of Gilligan's Island itself. More than 60 years after Gilligan's Island first aired, Tina Louise remains the final surviving castaway from one of television's most unforgettable sitcoms. While she spent much of her life trying to move beyond Ginger Grant, time ultimately turned her into the last living piece of a show that millions of people still watch today. The rest of the cast may be gone, but through reruns, streaming, and decades of memories, their strange little island adventure somehow never disappeared. Which Gilligan's Island character was always your favorite growing up? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more classic television stories.